Hello and welcome to Tommy Talks TV. I have one singular goal with this show, and that is to help you make smarter decisions so that you can have better relationships. I'd like to start as usual by saying a massive thank you. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for your likes and your shares and your comments on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. I really honestly appreciate you because you're helping us spread the message further faster. So thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to those of you who follow me on YouTube. I'd really want to encourage you to just like the videos and subscribe and click the notifications button so that you don't ever have to miss any of my videos, because very often I find that my audience on Facebook might say, well, where have you been? I've not been seeing your videos. It's because of the algorithm. But if you're on YouTube, you will be able to see all the videos that I have done in the past, and you will not miss any of the videos that I do in the future. So thank you very much for doing that. Now, today what I wanted to do was I want to share with you on what to do when you're no longer in love with your spouse. Now, this video is not intended to address marriages where maybe there's been a major issue such as infidelity, or maybe there's been abuse, or that sort of thing, because I've dealt with those sorts of things in other posts and other videos. But really what I want to focus on is, maybe you feel in your marriage as if things are slipping, they're no longer quite the way that they used to be. You feel like you're no longer in love with your spouse again, and you're wondering how to change things. Or maybe it is that your spouse has been complaining and basically saying, well, things are not the way that they used to be before. I'd really like things to change. So that's really what I want to address in this video. And the inspiration for this video actually came from a conversation that I had with, a husband some years back. So he'd been married for a few years, and I was having a telephone conversation with him about his marriage, and it was like, he was struggling to articulate what he had in his mind. And at one point, he just breathed, with a deep sigh and said, "Well, you see, the truth of the matter is this: I am no longer in love with my wife." Now, this was probably after, I don't know, maybe 3 years of marriage or so, and that just made me start to think about the kinds of perspective that we have about what it means to be in love with somebody, when you're married to that person. And I think there is actually a genuine problem in the way we perceive the whole idea of love, or what it means to be in love with someone. And I think the genesis of the problem is not far-fetched, to be honest. We've been sold a lie. We've been sold a lie by the media about, the character and the nature of what true love really is. And because of that, people spend their lives searching for this soulmate, this amazing, perfect person, this ideal person that would just light up, their lives, and, light all their fires, that will excite them endlessly, that will complete them perfectly. And, there's that expectation that there will never be any conflict with that person once they find this perfect soulmate, and they expect that, once they finally fall in love with this person, all their doubts about, the relationship will disappear. It'll be perfectly clear that they are meant for each other, that they're made for each other. They will not experience any kind of, normalcy or ordinariness. It will always be exciting. That's not the reality. You see, anticipating that, loving your soulmate will always be exciting and always energizing and always perfect is not the reality of life. Because I think what happens is that people fall in love with the idea of being in love. They expect it to be heady and, to always be on a high, and they're full of all these aspirations. And then they get married, and then after, several months or years, their world comes completely crashing down because their soulmate doesn't seem to fit, them as perfectly as they thought that they would. I honestly think that, it's a myth. It's a myth, because the reality of love and of marriage is quite different. But then what you do when you get to this point where you feel like, oh, this is not the fairy tale that I thought it would be, is really crucial. So at this point, there really are three choices. Some people come to the mistaken conclusion that they've made a mistake marrying their spouse, and they become so convinced that the only way to happiness is to leave their spouse and to go searching for love again. That is a huge mistake, a huge mistake. And then I find other people who just feel, well, okay, well, it is what it is. They just resign themselves to the reality of just having a loveless marriage, so to speak, and they just feel, well, I'm just going to hang in here because of the social status, or for my children, or maybe for financial reasons. And I also feel that that is not ideal as well. But there is a third way, and that is God's way. And that's what I really want to focus my attention on in the next two sessions that I'm going to be doing. So this session and the next session. So I'm going to break this into two parts. And I really think that we need to make a distinction between that concept of being in love the way Hollywood or movies or videos or social media has portrayed it, and the reality of what love really is. It is normal for relationships to start off with emotional highs. In fact, if you're not on an emotional high when you fall in love with somebody, or when you're planning to get married to that person, then you should be sort of wondering. It is. I always feel that God does that to kind of like draw us into the idea of actually getting married to someone, to help us pay attention to that person. But if we attempt to draw upon that emotion as the strength of a marriage, if we attempt to build our marriage on the basis of emotion, we will find that we will fail miserably, because emotion can be so fickle. That's what the nature of emotion is. So emotion, you don't feel happy all the time, you don't feel sad all the time, and that's what emotion is. So sometimes you might feel up, sometimes you may feel down, and that's the reason why emotions cannot sustain a marriage, because the very nature of emotions is that they are inconsistent and they're totally unpredictable. So if your love is an emotion, or you're expecting that you're going to build your marriage on the basis of an emotion of love, then you will find that it would not be able to stand the test of time. One thing that you do find that is predictable, though, is decision. And that is really key. Decision. Decision love is the kind of love that sustains a marriage. Once the emotion seems to have evaporated for a while, or maybe the emotions are coming and going, decision is what sustains the marriage, because decision is something that you have absolute control over. You don't have control over your emotions necessarily, but you do have control over the decisions that you make. And at some stage in your marriage, you're going to have to make a switch from an emotion driven commitment to your spouse to a decision driven commitment to your spouse. And we've got to be decisive and determined that we're going to love our spouse, no matter how you feel when you wake up in the morning, because you don't always feel loving or lovable when you wake up first thing in the morning. But you've got to make up your mind that you're going to love based on a decision, and that is the foundation for a lasting marriage. Now, somebody may be wondering, well, what does this mean? Does this mean that I've been sentenced to a boring marriage, or an unsatisfactory marriage for the rest of my life, and I just have to decide to just grin and bear it? No, that's not what I'm saying. Actually, there's a scripture that I read many years ago, which has sort of stuck with me as a blueprint for rekindling the love in your marriage. And it's a scripture that actually talks about our relationship with God, but I feel it's so applicable to our relationship with our spouse as well, and I'd like to share it with us. So it's in Revelation chapter 2, and it's verses 4 and 5a, and I'm going to read it for us. So it says, "You have left the love you had in the beginning. So remember where you were before you fell. Change your hearts and do what you did at first." Now, this was God, and it was speaking to one of the churches that were addressed in the book of Revelation. But I feel this is so applicable to marriage as well. So he says here, "You have left the love that you had in the beginning." I see 4 key principles for rekindling love in this scripture, and I'm just going to share them with you. I'll share 2 this week, and then I'll share the other 2 next week. So the first thing is this: think about, how have you changed? How have you changed in your marriage? Because that scripture starts with that phrase, "You have left." So just let that sink in for a minute. You have left suggests that when you fall out of love, it's usually because something has changed in you. The tendency is to want to blame, our changed feelings on our spouse. But usually what is really happening is that you have changed the way that you view your spouse. So the first step towards rekindling love is to take responsibility for our feelings, and not blame our feelings on our spouse. So if you're thinking things like, well, I would love her more if she starts meeting my needs, or, the reason why I no longer love my husband again is because, he hurt me, that indicates that we have entered into a blame cycle. And once we enter into a blame cycle, nothing good can come out of that. So, a lot of times what happens is that, when we enter the blame cycle, we place an expectation on our spouse, and then they fail to meet those expectations, and then we blame them for it, and then because of that we refuse to meet their needs, and then it just becomes a cycle. So, expectation is not met, and then there's blame, and then, we refuse to meet their needs, and then it just goes on and on and on, and it becomes a vicious cycle, and that just squeezes the love out of a marriage. If you find yourself in a position where you're thinking, my marriage will change when my spouse changes, that is a very disempowering thought, because that means, that you're in a position where you can do nothing because you have no control over your spouse's behavior. If you have ever tried to control your spouse's behavior, you would have found that it really doesn't work. You have control over your behavior, but not over your spouse's behavior. So the thing is this, when we start to think instead, my marriage would change because I am becoming more loving, I'm becoming more caring, I'm becoming more responsive, I'm focusing on what I can do in the marriage, and then I'm leaving the rest to God, and, just praying about my spouse and my marriage and all that. All of a sudden you find that you're back in control, and that changes the atmosphere of your home, because as long as you keep, pushing and, fussing and trying to force your spouse to do things, it never really works. I mean, there's no reason why you can't, open your heart and share your needs with your spouse. As a matter of fact, you should do that, communicate your needs. But then on the other hand, you can't try to make your spouse do certain things, but rather think to yourself, how have I changed? How has my perspective of my spouse changed? And what do I need to do to return myself back to the kind of perspective that I had of my spouse when I first fell in love with them in the first place? So that's the first thing that you need to think about. How have you changed? The second thing is this: remember where you were. That's what that scripture says. It says, you have left the love you had in the beginning. So remember where you were before you fell. Remember where you were before you fell. You see, so I think that, this is really the next step towards rekindling, lost love. Remember how your relationship started in the first place, why you fell in love with your spouse in the first place. For some people, it may be 5 years ago, or maybe you're like me and you've been married for 25, 26 years, or, maybe you've been married for even longer than that. So your memories are a lot further back than for someone that's just been married for a couple of years. But the point is this: very often, the cares of life will rob us of all those beautiful memories of, what our love used to be like, and the kind of relationship that we've had, the good times we've had together, and we forget the strengths that attracted us to our spouse in the first place, because, maybe the current situation, or maybe the things that they're not doing kind of blind us to the reality of the strengths that they carry. But one thing I always say to people is this: there were certain things that attracted you to your spouse in the first place when you first got married to them, and those things, those strengths are still there. It may seem as if they're buried under, all sorts of things, maybe behavior that you don't quite like, or them not giving you the attention that you desire. But you've got to remember that the strengths that attracted you, that drew you to that person in the first place, are still there. Maybe you're at this particular point in time, you're fixated on certain weaknesses, but remind yourself that there are still strengths that drew you to your spouse within your spouse. Remember how convinced you were, that your spouse was a gift from God, and rather than using your memory to recollect your spouse's failures, then you got to use your memory to recapture the good times, and focus on restoring your relationship to its former beauty. Your spouse is still the same person that you fell in love with, so you've got to refuse to allow, any current conflict that you have to cloud your perspective. I always believe that you can recover what is lost, but we've got to learn how to use our memory as a weapon that helps us work on our marriages. So use your memory as a weapon to set you up for victory in your marriage. Don't lose the wonder of your love. Don't take your spouse for granted. Think about all the amazing things that they've done for you, and they're still currently doing, and express your appreciation for your spouse. A lot of times when we're facing difficulty in life, maybe there are challenges in life, and sometimes you might feel like, oh, God has abandoned me. Why has God allowed this to happen to me? One of the most powerful weapons in that kind of situation is remembering what God has done in the past. We go into praise and we go into worship and we remember, Lord, you did this for me when my back was against the wall. You did that for me and all that. If you did that in the past, I know you can still do something else in the future. Do the same for your marriage. Remember the amazing things that your spouse has done in the past. Remember the amazing times that you have shared together, and reconfigure the way you view your spouse, the way you think about your spouse, because the beauty of that person still lies hidden underneath all those things that you're grappling with at this particular point in time. So use your memory for the benefit of your marriage. Now, I think I'm going to leave it here for today, and then next week I'll come back and I'll share with you the other parts of this message. But I hope this has helped you. If this has helped you, then please leave me a message on Facebook, on Instagram, or YouTube, or wherever it is you're watching. And if you've got a question you'd like me to answer, then head on over to tommytalks.com/ask, and I'll answer your question next time. See you next time. Bye bye.